Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to get to work on the Civic wagon. Want to replace some suspension components to try to get this ride as comfortable as possible. So we're going with an assortment of different parts. The first thing, we're going to use the Hardrace. These are the lower control arms for the rear. I wanted them to look nice, but I also wanted something that has the rubber bushing still. I do not want to compromise the ride quality with going with urethane. For the front arms, I am just going to replace the bushings on the front lower control arms. These are also the Hardrace. Now for the rear, I'm going to use the energy suspension. These are the rear trailing arm bushings. I did it for cost. They were a lot less expensive than the Hardrace, and I've used these before on daily drivers. I like the way they feel. People complain about the energy suspension rear trailing arm bushings creating a snap oversteer, but I'm not driving this car hard at all. It's just a daily driver, so it's not going to be put through any extreme circumstances in driving. And for the front, we're going to put the energy suspension. These are the radius rod bushings. I just wanted to replace those also because mine are very old. And while I have the car on jack stands, since I'll be lifting it up to get to all the suspension, I'm going to put on a new master cylinder because mine's leaking. And at the same time, when I remove the lower control arms, I have the energy suspension Sway Bar Endlinks. These are off of my track car since I upgraded to that ST bar. So I saved these for the wagon so I can get rid of the old rubber ones that are probably very worn out. I'm going to get this master cylinder changed before I do anything else. This one's leaking and started eating away my paint down there a little bit. So I wanted to get it replaced just because it leaks relatively quickly now. So I'm just going to get that taken care of before I get to everything else. We're going to get started on the front suspension first. We need to get the front lower control arm removed. So we're going to have to take off a handful of things. First, the wheel spindle nut. You had to remove the whole fork. Also the lower ball joint. I take the lower ball joint off because it's easier to get the CV axle out of the way. That way we can get to the two bolts. There's one right there and there's one right behind the fork. Those are for the radius rod, which goes to the front of the car because we're changing out the bushing up front here also. And the Sway Bar end link. Start by removing your 32mm wheel spindle nut. Next, remove the 14mm nut on, this is a bolt on the top of the fork. On the bottom, you have a 17mm nut and a bolt. Sometimes the head of the bolt is on this side and the nut is on the reverse side. I always feed the bolt from the front to the rear, so my nut is on the rear of the fork. Once you have both those bolts removed, you should be able to remove the fork. Next, I'm going to remove the ball joint. The reason I'm doing this is so I can lift the knuckle up, and I can pull the axle away from the knuckle. It'll give me more room to access these two bolts on top of the radius rod. Mine is a 19mm nut. Yours might be a 17, possibly even an 18mm. But go ahead and get this removed. Now we need to get the radius rod removed. Before you remove these two bolts here, you need to remove the nut that is at the front of this radius rod. The reason being, if you remove both of these, when you pull these out and you're cranking at that nut at the front of it, you'll just keep spinning this bar over and over. It will not allow you to remove that nut off the front. To make it easier to get the radius rod off, remove the two 10mm bolts that hold the radiator stays on. You're going to want to do that on both sides. That way we can lift up at the radiator and it allows us a lot more room to get to this bolt here, this nut here, because the radiator hangs right here, and with your socket and your ratchet it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult. So I found that to be the easiest way to get that 17mm nut removed. Now go ahead and remove the two 17mm bolts that are attached to the radius rod. Now you can just pull straight out. If you have a stock suspension, your brake line brackets should have been attached to the shock. Mine just hang here because I have the function form type ones and they don't have any sort of bracket on them. So if you're curious about that, that's why mine are just hanging here. Yours shouldn't be any problem if you're on that stock suspension though. They'll still be just out of the way from everything. Now you need to get the Sway Bar Endlink removed. It is a 12mm nut on both sides, and there's a 12mm one in the middle. So if you use a socket on top and then a wrench in the middle, you can get the top one off and then just do it for the reverse side as well. And lastly, I know it's a little dark, but you have a 14mm bolt right here. That's the only other thing holding the control arm up. The end link here is stuck in the middle because I can't push it down any further. So go ahead and remove that 14mm bolt and we'll get the control arm removed. And here's a look at those old bushings. You can see how it's not centered any longer. The little metal cylinder is now, it's sagging towards the bottom of the control arm just from the weight of the car and of course deterioration and age. You can see it, I don't know, you can see it right here, the cracking in the rubber. It's also a little loose around the sleeve here. The inner one looks a little better. It is old, you can see a little bit of cracking and it's a little off too. This one sags a little low there and it's a little high on this side. But we just get those swapped out real quick. And this is a relatively easy process if you own a press. If you do not own a press or you don't have access to one, I don't think there's another way you can attempt to do this. Now to get these pressed out, I am using two different size sockets. This one is a 27mm and this one is a 21mm. I already completed the process on the driver's side, so I know these work perfect. And the 21mm, okay, this is the flat side. The flat side that's really flat, this is the inside of the car. We're gonna lay that down flat on top of a larger socket. This one is gonna go into on top of it. We're gonna use a press just to press it out. Same with the 27mm. You can noticeably see how this side is a lot flatter. It's flat and this one is a little bit more rounded off. It's easier to put the larger socket there when we push it through. And these are the two sockets that we're going to use on the reverse side. When we push the smaller bushing through, it'll slide in and won't get stuck in there. And for the larger one, we also have a larger socket here. There it is, got those pressed out. Now let's get the new ones pressed right back in. Okay, now we're trying to get it pressed back in. I got a larger 30mm socket on top. That way it's a little bit larger than the diameter of the bushing itself. And let's see if we can get in. Looks like we got it. perfect. And here it is finished with the new bushings in. Can be kind of a pain in the butt using the press, but just gotta get it lined up straight. You can see it like nicked it here a little bit, but it's just a metal cylinder on the outside, not a big deal. And this one looks good to go also. I'm gonna start by changing out these. These are the radius rod bushings. This one's already off. There's a little metal cylinder which needs to stay on there in the middle. But really easy to replace now. That one goes like that, and then when you feed it through, just gotta get the other bushing out on the washer, and it's gonna go on like that, and your nut. So go ahead and feed this one through and just get the nut started on the end. Once that's in there, I just leave it hanging. Makes it easier to tighten up those two bolts when you reassemble it. Go ahead and put your control arm on. When tightening this bolt on the inside, do not tighten it all the way. Leave it so there's maybe like 1 millimeter out. We do not want to put any stress on these because we need to load the suspension before tightening it. Same with the one for the fork. Put the bolt in, put the nut on, but leave like 1 millimeter of space between the washer and the cylinder here. That way it can still, when you lower the car, they're gonna twist with it. They're not gonna bind the new rubber bushings that we just spent all this time replacing. So go ahead and reinstall that and get everything else put back together. Reinstall your radiator brackets. Once you have it all finished, put your wheels back on. Then once we lower the car to the ground, we're going to torque the wheel spindle nut to 150 foot-pounds of torque. Then we're going to take it for a ride, and we're going to come back and tighten up both of the bolts that connect to the lower control arm where the fork is and where it connects to the body. We're going to work on the rear lower control arms and the rear trailing arm bushings in a part 2 of this video. Now after you drove it around and you're satisfied with the settling of the suspension, from the front of it, I already tightened my passenger side. You can get to it from here. If you slide your arm in there, tighten it up at the control arm, and from this side you're gonna need a ratchet and a wrench. Just tighten those up and you'll be good to go with the front end. After finishing up that front suspension, I didn't have enough time to work on the rear today, so I decided to just kind of clean up the engine bay. I have my ballasts for my HIDs just laying there. This one was laying on top. I'm mounting it underneath. And I also wanted to put that short ram 2.5 inch intake that I have on my track car in here. So I took out the air box, the little air piping, the actual intake filter box, and the PM6 tube. And down here, I'm gonna mount my HID ballast. I didn't know what to do with it because it didn't have a bracket, so it's cool. I had this aluminum that was laying around. It was basically a long, flat piece. So I wrapped it around and just bent it by hand, drilled a hole in it, and it's gonna mount right here. There's the original hole where the air box was. So I drilled the 2 holes and I'm gonna throw the ballast down right there. Let's see how that looks real quick. That came out really nice. I like the way that looks. Don't gotta worry about it moving around or banging around on anything. Got the wiring out of place as well. It just cleans up a lot of the headlight wiring. I just tucked them down through that little area instead. Well, I got it all cleaned up. Probably doesn't look like much of a difference, but to me I can tell it looks so much nicer, a little bit cleaner there, a little more organized. Got the intake on as well. And I also got that ballast removed and located under the bumper just like I did on the passenger side.